morning, everyone. Thank you for joining the Smithsonian National Postal Museum's lecture with Dr. Richard Curran. My name is Ali Matleski, and I'm part of the advancement team at the National Postal Museum. I am pleased to introduce Elliot Gruber, Director of the Smithsonian National Postal Museum. Elliot joined the Smithsonian in September 2017 and has embarked on a campaign to increase the reach and impact of the Postal Museum's exhibitions, public programs, and research. Elliot has more than 30 years of service in the nonprofit community, including museum-related positions at the Gettysburg Foundation in Pennsylvania and the Mariners Museum and Park in Newport News, Virginia. He has also held leadership positions with the National Parks Conservation Association, the Civil War Trust, and the Ocean Conservancy. We are incredibly grateful that he has brought his talents and vision to the Smithsonian National Postal Museum. Elliot, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ali, and welcome to the Smithsonian National Postal Museum webinar featuring Dr. Richard Curran and Dan Piazza. When I was first hired as director of the National Postal Museum, Secretary Skorton said he needed help. He went on to say that when most people think of the Smithsonian, they thought of the National Air and Space Museum, the National Museum of American History, the National Museum of Natural History, the Zoo, and now the National Museum of African American History and Culture. But he said that we have more than a dozen other museums, including the National Postal Museum. He asked me to help turn the National Postal Museum from a hidden gem into a gem and hidden no longer. And with the help of leadership and our staff and 2 advisory councils, we have been doing just that at the National Postal Museum. From our Hamilton exhibit to our upcoming Baseball America's Home Run, to our increase in visitation both online and on-site, we have begun making an even more significant impact. We have 2 special guests here tonight with us to talk about the diversity of the incredible collections that the Smithsonian has. Smithsonian Distinguished Scholar Richard Curran will provide you with a fascinating journey through some of the more unusual objects at the Smithsonian, and Postal Museum Chief Curator Dan Piazza will highlight some surprising and interesting links and connections between these objects and the Postal Museum's collection. The National Postal Museum has the 2nd largest collection of any Smithsonian museum. And while we have the definitive collection of American postal history and US philately, the majority of our collection is international. Indeed, if you think about it, the National Postal Museum may be, along with the National Zoo, have the most diverse international holdings of any Smithsonian museum. We have many special guests this evening with us. Chris Haase, Chair of the Board of Regents Advancement Committee, LA Regional Council member, and a great champion of all things Smithsonian, including the National Postal Museum, and of course, the National Air and Space Museum's Udvar Hazy Center. Thank you for joining us, Chris. We also have Smithsonian National Board members, members of the regional councils and alumni, along with supporters of many other Smithsonian museums. And I would like to say a special thank you to the Postal Museum Advisory Council members and supporters who are also attending this webinar. I am also grateful to have our friends from the Museo de Filatelia in Oaxaca, Mexico, one of our longtime partners, joining us tonight. Thank you also to the Red Sox and San Francisco Giants, partners with us on our baseball exhibition, for being here as well. And thank you all for spending some time with us this evening and for your assistance throughout the entire year. And now, on with our program. Dr. Richard Curran is the Smithsonian's Distinguished Scholar and Ambassador at Large. As a member of the institution's senior leadership team, Richard focuses on strategic direction, partnerships, public representation, philanthropic support, and special initiatives, including saving our endangered cultural heritage. Richard served as Smithsonian Undersecretary for more than a decade, and as a director or acting director of several museums and programs during his 4 decades at the Smithsonian. An anthropologist with a PhD from the University of Chicago, Richard taught at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies and has authored several books, including Reflections of a Culture Broker, A View from the Smithsonian, Hope Diamond, The Legendary History of a Cursed Gem, and the best-selling Smithsonian's History of America in 101 Objects. He is a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and the Atlantic Council. Richard consults closely with the US government and international agencies and serves on several museum, foundation, and university boards. Richard, it's an honor and a privilege to have you joining us here this evening.
Thank you. The museums have certainly enabled and enhanced the reputation of what Smithson could hardly even imagine. The newest museum, of course, is our African American Museum that opened several years ago, that's had great attendance. And I think at that time really represented an act of national will. I include this slide here because John Lewis, who really labored over a period of 17 years to make that museum a reality, was really a major force for the museum and loved it. As you know, the exhibits of the Smithsonian, the exhibitions, really attract visitors, teach, inform, and even if you've stood by the Star Spangled Banner in the American History Museum, as I say to people, that really is the Star Spangled Banner. That's the one we sing about. And it's tremendously inspirational. But so too is the Moonlander test vehicle at Air and Space, and the Sant Ocean Hall, and the portrait gallery with not only our icons of history, but current icons of the American experience. And exhibits like the American Enterprise at the National Museum of American History, really informing so many. The root of the Smithsonian's work is really in its collections. And the Smithsonian has an unparalleled collection. It really is the largest collection of any museum anywhere, and just runs the gamut from here depicted items from the Civil War era, including that famous Lincoln Crack portrait, to what became postcards depicting the horrors of slavery. As Elliot mentioned, stamps. The Postal Museum has the second largest collection at the Smithsonian, and the rarest of stamps. Artwork from around the world, and airplanes and spaceships. These out at the Udvar-Hazy Center. This is what it looks like backstage. If you've ever been backstage at some of the museums, and this is natural history, this is what 3 million birds look like. And they have to be taken care of course. And this is what I affectionately call our wet collections that we keep in storage out at the Udvar-Hazy Center. And if you read Dan Brown's novel, he blows this up fictionally in the beginning of that novel. Taking care of all this stuff is a big challenge, of course. We need to take care of it. And increasingly, as the Smithsonian realized it, you know, when we first started collecting birds, it was because of Audubon and his influence on the Secretary of the Smithsonian, Spencer Baird. We collected a lot of birds. Little did we realize at the time, we didn't know about DNA. Well, now we realize that our collections of organic material are actually a library and an archive of life on the planet. And so we've invested heavily in cryo storage because we realize that we need to preserve that DNA for the future, because there may be many things unlocked as a result of it. Around the world, and this is something that people don't realize so much about the Smithsonian, is the breadth of our research. So we do a tremendous amount in sustaining the planet. We have a whole unit, about 600 people in Panama at our Tropical Research Institute. We have scientists at our Environmental Research Center, at our Conservation Biology Center, at the zoo, and so on. And we do a lot of work in understanding the planet, the ecology, environmental change, and species. Indeed, we have a worldwide project. We cooperate with scores and scores of institutions to understand climate change around the planet. Every year, we're measuring millions and millions of trees to see the effect of carbon dioxide on the planet. This has led us, and in fact, in the midst of COVID, back in April, we ended up doing, and we had planned an Earth Optimism Summit to bring people from around the planet, scientists and others, working on solutions to issues of climate change. We ended up having to do that virtually, but the Smithsonian really has emerged as one of the leading organizations working with others to really understand how to deal with this issue. And we call it Earth Optimism because we're looking for solutions and not just problems. We've done a lot in the preservation of species and bringing back species. I'm fond of that golden lion tamarin at the top of the screen, a very cute creature, but we've helped bring back the Arabian oryx as well. And of course, made tremendous efforts with the pandas, and we just had a birth, successful, of pandas. And it was really scientists at the Smithsonian, Joe Gale Howard, pictured in that photograph of Smithsonian veterinarians and scientists, who really pioneered the technique for how to get pandas pregnant and viable. And because of the Smithsonian's efforts with our Chinese colleagues, We've actually gotten the panda off the endangered list, doing much better. But we learned a lot from that. Here's something that people don't realize what we're doing because of our research with environments and species and so on. We understand the relationship between wildlife, domestic animals, and human beings. And we understand how diseases move. And if you're talking about zoonotic diseases, you're talking about things like avian flu, HIV, West Nile, Zika, and so on. And with Zika, we just happen to have at the Smithsonian the National Mosquito Collection. Whoever thought there was such a thing? But 25,000 mosquitoes from over a century ago, that gives us a clue into mutations of disease and understanding it. And we worked very heavily in Panama at a Tropical Research Institute to figure out how to make mosquitoes infertile so they would not produce, so they could not carry the Zika disease. And indeed, this is something we work with others. In April, Smithsonian scientists discovered 6 new coronaviruses in bats. If that doesn't scare you, it should. And currently, the Smithsonian, with other partners, is tracking about 1,200 different viruses. These are viral vectors that go from wildlife to domestic life to human beings. And the idea is to understand those routes of transmission, the vectors of those viruses, in order to prevent them from doing us harm in the future. So here we are in the midst of coronavirus, and Smithsonian scientists working exactly on it. And we train the next generation, so hopefully they'll be better prepared, better informed, and better able than we are to handle such things. We're also exploring the universe. This scene is Hawaii. It's not a beach in Hawaii. It's not a tropical paradise, but this is on top mountain in Hawaii, and we run land-based telescopes all over the planet, in Chile, in Greenland, and Arizona. And we also operate several space missions for NASA. The Smithsonian gets over $100 million a year from NASA to run various space missions, experimentation, do engineering and science. And the idea is to understand black holes, dark matter, exoplanets, and so on. And this is the first ever picture taken of a black hole. This effort came about as a result of a Smithsonian-led project organizing literally thousands of people around the planet to make the observations and put this together. And I expect that Shep Doeleman and the team that did this will end up winning a Nobel Prize for their efforts. This is a current project that the Smithsonian Astrophysical Observatory with the consortium is up to, trying to build this telescope. It's called the Giant Magellan Telescope on top of a mountain in the Atacama Desert. If you're looking for a trip to Chile, it's a great trip to go up there. The land is cleared. 3 of the mirrors are fabricated. We started construction, and this will be ready hopefully in a few years. And the idea with this telescope is to find evidence of life in the universe. To give you an idea of that telescope and how big it is, if you look at that slide and you see that arrow pointing, that's the size of a human being. So this is a huge telescope for a huge mission. And the Smithsonian, not only relying on its own scientists and scholars and collaborating folks from other institutions, engages a lot of citizen volunteers in this effort to understand the universe. I think as all Americans look to understanding our country, particularly when times are unsettling and challenging, as all people in the United States want to better understand the American experience. And the Smithsonian has played a major role in doing it through a number of its museums, the Postal Museum included, American history, the Portrait Gallery, and so on, to really understand the American experience. This year, we're particularly concentrating on doing research and collection activities with regard to women in the history, because we're celebrating the 100th anniversary of women's suffrage. We also have a very generous donation to start a Latino gallery, and that is in planning for the American History Museum. Because again, we understand the need for expanding that story, telling everybody's story, doing it well, and not just telling the story, but hoping people benefit from it and people's neighbors and fellow citizens benefit from it. Indeed, one of the things that's wrecked all of us is issues of law enforcement. Some of the events that have happened of recent, the strain in the national fabric that's caused. And the National Museum of African American History and Culture, after events in Ferguson a few years ago, started advising and working with police departments around the country to advise them on race relations, the history of race, and so on in our country, so that police departments should be better prepared. And while the museum was open, we would get many, many visits from police departments, again, around the country, sending their trainers, sending their officers, sending even recruits who are coming into policing to come to the African American Museum and better understand what they, their ancestors, their fellow citizens, and so on, gone through. And you can only imagine how many calls and contacts we are having these days in the last weeks and months about this issue and trying to help out as we can. We're also doing work around the world. We try to find the first humans and figure out what made us human and how human evolution took place. We work around the world in cultures, whether it be the Tibetan Plateau or the Inca Road in the Andes in South America, or on Egyptian mummies. And our studies vary from culture to archaeology. Hans Froelich there, the guy with the mummy, is actually looking at mummies to see their arterial sclerosis and whether they had some of the same problems that we have today. And if they did, what was the source in the diet that may have caused that back then, because they did not have the kind of synthetic foods and heavy sugar diet and so on that we have today. So we're trying to find those clues. We do a lot of work on human migration, adaptation, climate change, and how it's affecting native peoples around the world, people who are on the edge of environments where environmental change has tremendous and quick effects and impacts on their lives. Something that I got into first after the Haiti earthquake in 2010 was our effort to save cultures around the planet that were challenged by either natural disasters or human conflicts. And we've been working very hard in Iraq, some in Syria as well, free areas of Syria, not so much lately, but certainly in Iraq, to try to help people protect their treasures in light of ISIS, in light of Assad's barrel bombs, and so on. And so in the upper quadrant there, you see ISIS people destroying the Mosul Museum. Well, right now we are working in the Mosul Museum with our Iraqi colleagues, with colleagues from the Louvre and the World Monuments Fund and others, to help restore that museum and bring back a modicum of civic life in Mosul that was devastated by ISIS. You see in the top left of your screen, that's not the moon. Those are looting pits at our Europa famous site, and it represents what ISIS was doing in terms of looting. And the Smithsonian actually works very closely, maybe surprise to some, with the FBI, with Interpol, with other law enforcement to try to stem such looting and so on. Right now, in the lower part, you see some of our folks with Iraqis working at the site of Nimrud that was blown up by ISIS. When US and allied forces invaded Mosul and Raqqa, they turned to the Smithsonian because of our work with them, and we produced these guides. These are pocket guides. They go in the pockets of uniforms, people in camouflage outfits. They had what not to destroy in Mosul, and then again in the invasion of Raqqa. So we produced that with the military, with DOD, with NATO, and some of our work with, again, Homeland Security, FBI, DOD, DIA, State Department has really led us to sign, me, I look pretty good over there, haven't worn a tie in a few months, with General Kogan, who's now the head. We signed an agreement for the Smithsonian to train the next generation of monuments men and women. And many, many people signed up. And so we're starting to do that actually next week via Zoom. But we save heritage in Haiti, there you see, and in Nepal and in other places. Right now, we're starting to help people in Yemen. We are advising people in Beirut as a result of the explosion. And that effort overseas also led us to help out domestically in New York and in Superstorm Sandy, and South Carolina with flooding, Texas with flooding, and Houston as a result of their hurricanes, Puerto Rico and Virgin Islands after Maria. So we do a lot of work in this area to save culture, take care of things not only in the museums, but outside the museums. And we continue to work on Nazi looted art. In fact, thanks to, I think the Uretz are on this call, they and others helped me out recently. The Monuments Men Diaries came up for auction recently, earlier this summer. It was George Stouts. He was the guy played by George Clooney in the movie, The Monuments Men. That came up for auction. A number of Smithsonian folks really helped us out in getting it. We're very appreciative of that addition to our collection. We continue to write books and inform people everywhere. We continue to loan objects. This past year, because of the anniversary of Apollo 11, that was traveling around, but the shot at the museum there is the 9/11 Museum, and a lot of the objects there came from those collected by the Smithsonian and on loan to that museum. We continue our work with Smithsonian Channel. Our view is to try to reach 1 billion people a year around the planet, not just the 30 million people that might visit the museums, at least when we reopen. But the idea is to use the channel and other mechanisms to reach people. With COVID, we faced an interesting issue because we had to reach people and our museums really weren't open. And so we put a lot of material out digitally. I just did this. This was offered for free through the great courses. I was really struck by the fact that all those millions of students who come to the Smithsonian during the spring for their trip, and for many, it's a once-in-a-lifetime experience, didn't get that chance. And so we did this great course, great tours of Washington, D.C. It's 24 lectures, and I got some people like Colin Powell and Jose Andres and Yo-Yo Ma, Lonnie Bunch, of course, the secretary, Dave Rubenstein, others, to join me on that tour of Washington. So instead of people coming to Washington and experience the nation's capital, we could bring it to students and teachers around the country. And many of the museums did the same thing in terms of bringing their collections, their knowledge out. We're continuing to do our stuff through the web, through social media, and it's a lot of good work by a lot of people, about 6,500 staff, 12,000 volunteers, members of partner institutions, support from Congress, regions, boards, all of you and the American people that makes this effort possible. Now, just to end on a note with regard to the Postal Museum, I just wanted to point out the Postal Museum in my own work. I had done a book on the Hope Diamond about 15 years ago, and opening the book begins with the delivery of the Hope Diamond in this package, and that package is indeed at the Postal Museum. And I remember when I went to the Postal Museum and saw it, I realized the first paragraph of my book was wrong. It was wrong because of the annotations of that package in the Postal Museum collection. I had to change at least the first page of my book because of the notations on there that pointed out an error I had made. But I want to say that, my wife was teaching today. She's a teacher in Fairfax County, doing it digitally. And her favorite museum is the Postal Museum. She's dealing with a lot of immigrant kids, a lot of kids new to the country. And she just finds that the use of stamps is a great way of getting it. It's very tangible, it's very topical, and she uses her visits to the Postal Museum as a vehicle for teaching her second and third and fourth graders over at Bailey's Elementary School, and she can't wait to get back. And then finally, and maybe an homage to Cheryl Gans, who I think is on the line, who was our chief curator for many years at the Postal Museum. Given the discussion in our country about voting and the use of the mail and the postal service and everything, whoever thought that in 2020, the National Postal Museum might be the most important museum in the country for understanding our democracy? It's a great place. I'm grateful for Elliot and his crew over at the Postal Museum for having me. I'm also grateful to you all. I've been doing this from my home. Sometimes I've been, and I think of Chris Varhazi on the line and Gordon Eubanks online. I've actually lectured in your homes, so now you're coming to mine. But I'm very, very grateful for your work and all of your support. Thank you so much. And now over to Dan Piazza, Chief Curator over at the Postal Museum.
Well, I'm going to jump in here, Richard, to say really thank you very, very much. I always learn so much every time I hear you speak, and I did as well today. I also would like to remind everyone on the call that if you have any questions, please look at the bottom of your screen for the Q&A function and to submit those questions via there, and then we'll come to the questions shortly. But first, also, it's my pleasure to introduce Dan Piazza, who is the Chief Curator at the Smithsonian National Postal Museum. Dan collects and writes about the stamps and postal history of the United States during the Bureau period from 1894 to 1978, as well as the Italian Peninsula. He sits on the Board of Governors of the Vatican Philatelic Society and edits its journal, Vatican Notes. He has also received the Society's Veritas and President's Awards for scholarship and service, respectively. His other national memberships include the American Philatelic Society, the American Philatelic Research Library, American First Aid Cover Society, and Writers Union number 30. Locally, he serves as literature chairman for the NAPEX exhibition and belongs to both the Washington Stamp Collectors Club and the Baltimore Philatelic Society. In addition to his philatelic activities, Dan is an academic historian specializing in U.S. history to 1760. He holds his degrees from Wagner College and Syracuse University and has completed the coursework for his PhD. And now, Dan, thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you for that introduction, Elliot, and you also, Richard, for that illuminating talk. And I'm going to attempt to pick up a little bit where you left off with that question of who would have thunk it that the Postal Museum would be so important to understanding democracy in the year 2020. And I want to suggest that I think at least one potential answer to that question is that the founders of the Republic would not be terribly surprised to learn that the postal system is playing such a central role in democracy and elections and voting this year. I'm going to talk very briefly about some objects in our collection that are related to that. The first object is kind of hard to see on a screen. It's a large broadside sheet. But this is actually the signed copy of the Postal Act of 1792, which established the Post Office Department as a permanent executive agency of the United States government. And you say, well, I mean, the post office existed before 1792. Doesn't it go back to 1775 and the year before the Declaration of Independence? And the answer to that is yes, it does. The Continental Congress established the post office in 1775. But for the first nearly 20 years of its existence, the post office was on annual appropriations. It wasn't a permanent agency of the government. And the reason for that is that there were very sharp disagreements over the nature and role of the Postal Service in social and political life should be in the new country. And this was because the founders came from an experience where the Royal Postal Service, in many occasions, had been used to spy on their activities and their political organizing in the years leading up to the American Revolution. So they were very wary of making the Post Office Department a permanent and very powerful agency in the government. In the end, two arguments really sort of won them over to making the post office a permanent agency. Here, by the way, here's an example of a letter from 1775. And you can see the notation perhaps in the lower right-hand corner of the letter, Constitutional Post. The founders were so concerned about their mail being opened and read by royal officials that they set up their own shadow postal system. You've heard also of the committees of correspondence, which were another shadow postal system that operated alongside the Royal Post Office in the years leading up to the Revolution. Two arguments convinced the founders of the need for a postal service, though. And here's one of them, the money. This is Benjamin Franklin's ledger as Postmaster General in 1770 and 1771. And you can see the balance in the post office accounts was 5,800 pounds sterling. That's a lot of money in 1770. And the federal government had very few mechanisms at its disposal in the early years for raising revenue. All they had really were customs and import duties, excise taxes on things like alcohol, and postal revenues. So the federal government desperately needed a source of revenue, but also they felt that the establishment of a post office and encouraging communication among the new states and the new nation would lead to greater political literacy and political knowledge among the citizens and would foster democracy. So right from the beginning, we hear a lot in the media and commentary today about, well, the Postal Service is a business. No, the Postal Service has a social mission and is a public service. Well, it's both, really. That's the nub of the issue. It's both, and it has been from the very beginning. It's expected to have this social mission of promoting democracy and enabling political organization while also turning a profit and making money for the federal government. This argument that we're having today would have, I think much of it would have resonated very deeply with the founding generation. Now, what they had in mind was political activity like this piece, which is from 1848. It actually has the first US postage stamp on it, a 5-cent stamp featuring Benjamin Franklin. But this is a circular laying out a party platform for the Free Soil Party in the 1848 presidential election. The Free Soil Party was an offshoot of the Whig Party, what would become the Republican Party, led by the former president Martin Van Buren. But this is the type of organization and political activity I think that was envisioned very early on, that pamphlets and circulars and letters expressing political opinions and the exchange of ideas, that a functioning and healthy postal system would facilitate that. We don't really get voting by mail in the sense that we're talking about it today until the American Civil War. And in the American Civil War, 1861 to 1865, particularly in the 1864 presidential election, is the first time you have large numbers of ballots being cast by mail. And this is from soldiers in the field. And in the Civil War, most of these units and regiments were raised state by state. And so it was very easy, in a sense, to, among all the regiments from a particular state, to appoint various officers to accept the ballots and tally them up. And this is a copy of a letter back to the Highland County Court in the state of Ohio. And you see it says tally sheet from the field hospital, from a field hospital in the American Civil War, the 2nd Division. So in this case, it's not actually ballots being sent back, but someone, likely an officer in the unit or an officer in command, was appointed to tabulate, tally, and record, probably a voice vote of all the soldiers, and then take that tally and that record of what the votes were and mail them back to the clerk in the court of the home county. And then as now, there was a lot of discussion and talk around whether allowing people to vote by mail, in this case soldiers in the field, would affect the outcome of the election. In the 1864 presidential election, Abraham Lincoln was running for re-election with a new vice presidential candidate, Andrew Johnson. And this was a risky proposition in 1864. No president had been re-elected to a second term since Andrew Jackson. And opening up voting by mail to soldiers in the field introduced a kind of unknown element into the electoral politics in 1864. No one knew where the Army would come out in this contest, because the candidate on the other side, on the Democratic ticket, was General McClellan, who Lincoln had famously demoted early on in the war. And although he hadn't been drummed out of the Army, he was still a serving officer. He was running for president as a major general in the United States Army. So which way would the Army break? Would they go for Lincoln, who had been their commander-in-chief now for going on 4 years? Would they go for McClellan, who was the veteran Army officer and who many felt had been treated badly in the early days of the war? This was a big unknown. So anytime you introduce these new policies and procedures into something as important as an election, I think it's only natural for there to be a certain amount of trepidation and nervousness about whether it's going to affect the outcome of the election. And there's an illustrated cover from the same period picturing Major General McClellan in the District of Columbia. The next time we really get massive numbers of votes cast by mail is in the Second World War. And here you can see the procedure has changed a bit somewhat. This is not an officer tallying a unit's whole vote count and sending it in, but these are individual soldiers and men and women in the auxiliary forces as well, who are casting their ballots. First, applying for a ballot by mail. And this is a postcard. You can see here having to state that you're in the armed forces, the year of your birth, where you resided before you enlisted, and where you want to vote and receive your ballot, and your signature having to be witnessed by an officer. This is another one from Alabama of the same period. And then the soldier would be sent an official war ballot, postage paid, postage free, that they would have to fill out and sign an oath on the back of the envelope, sign across the seal of the envelope, and also get someone, usually again an officer in the unit, to witness their signature before mailing it back. Millions of votes were cast by mail in the Second World War, and we're probably on track this year to have more people voting by mail in this year than at any time really since the Second World War. In the last presidential election, I believe it was about a quarter of votes were cast by mail nationwide. It differs from state to state, but we're on track this year, I think, to have the largest vote by mail since the Second World War. So that's some material from our collection, I think, that relates to this. And what we're doing, it's a particularly frustrating time in some ways for the museum to be closed, because this is something of a postal moment. Everybody is thinking about, interested in, excited to an extent about postal policy and organization and leadership, and we're closed. So what we're doing in the meantime is giving presentations like this, doing a lot of media interviews. There have been a lot of interest from radio and television and print media over the last few days, giving talks and writing articles and blog posts to place online, and trying to give you as much access to our content and this sort of background and history of the Postal Service as we can at a time when many people are thinking and talking about it. So that's a little foray into current events, which is always a nerve-wracking proposition for a historian, but there it is.
Great. Thank you so much, Dan. We will now move to our Q&A section. Our first question that we have is for Richard, wondering if you could elaborate a bit more on the change that you had to make at the beginning of your book about the Hope Diamond based on your findings at the Postal Museum.
The first line of the book says, I think it was 11:30 and the postman was late. And that was referring to the date in November when the Hope Diamond was actually being delivered by a postal carrier from the Central Post Office in Washington, D.C., which is the same building as the Postal Museum is in. The guy drove down about a mile or so down to the Natural History Museum and delivered that package. Well, I thought I was wrong about the Postal Museum, the postal carrier. It was orchestrated. That is, the ceremony with the Postmaster General, the Secretary of the Smithsonian, all these dignitaries was scheduled for 11:30. And here it was getting late. It was 11:45 and the package wasn't delivered. And everybody was getting antsy. Well, that was actually planned stagecraft. And I realized when I looked at the package at the Postal Museum, and it's written very clearly there, do not deliver until 11:45. So the postal carrier was given instructions. He wasn't aware of the greater kind of dramatic plot, but he did exactly what he was told. And I didn't know that. So I had to change the book in the second edition to not accuse him of being late.
That is great. Thank you. And we have a question for Dan. How did you get these amazing historical materials for the Postal Museum?
Material comes to us in a number of ways. We do have some small acquisition funds. We do occasionally buy things at auction, although I don't think any of the particular pieces I showed today, I don't recall any of them coming to us through purchase or auction. These were all donations from individual donors over the years who've given them to us. This is material that's come into our collection. Most of it, I would say, between the 1980s and today. All this material has been collected both on the Colonial Post Office and the Civil War period.
Great, thank you. And our next question is for Richard and is actually about your surroundings. This comes from Pat Puente, who's one of our regional council members. She is wondering if you could talk about that picture behind you.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Hey, Pat, how are you? Good to hear your question. So the picture behind me is a Haitian artwork. After the earthquake in Haiti, the devastating earthquake in 2010, Haitian artists painted the quake. It was a way of processing their experience. Children also did that to process the experience of tremendous loss of friends and family. And it ended up being kind of therapeutic. But this painting depicts the National Cathedral in Haiti, Notre Dame. It was destroyed in the earthquake. It had been the center of national life. Sorry about that. And it shows people, Haitians, fleeing to the nearby port to escape the devastation, the falling buildings in the city. And so the port waters look red and bloody because to represent the literally over 200,000 people that were killed in Haiti. I bought this painting. It's done by a famous Haitian artist. My colleague, Janetta Cole, who was the director of the African Art Museum, bought a second painting from this artist in the series. He did a series of 3 paintings. I'm still trying to locate the person who bought the third one. But, it's been a feature of Haitian life, certainly going back to their independence and their abolition of slavery back in 1804 when they defeated Napoleon, but all the more so, really since the 50s that style of kind of taking everyday experience and turning it into art. And it's a lovely thing that people do in order to survive. I call it the art of survival.
That's really incredible. Thank you. It's a beautiful painting. On another note, Dan, we know that some of the early stamps featured founding fathers and others. When did the first stamps with African Americans appear, and who was featured, if you know that off the top of your head?
Yeah, the first postage stamp picturing an African American was issued in 1940. It's part of a series called the Famous American Series, and it shows Booker T. Washington as an educator. And then the second stamp featuring an African American was actually later on in the same series, featuring George Washington Carver as a scientist. So that was in the 1940s.
Wonderful. And we did have a request. We know that the Postal Museum is opening up our baseball exhibit soon. Could you give a very brief description of that?
Yes, the baseball exhibit will open hopefully next year. We're keeping an eye on everything in the schedules. Everything is fluid right now, but this is a project actually I've been working on for a number of years now, so no one would like to see it opened more dearly perhaps than the people on this call. But this will take a very sweeping and broad-ranging look at the game from its Mesoamerican origins all the way through the 1950s and 60s, but you do it entirely through the lens of stamps and mail. So what parts of the game's history have been commemorated through stamps? What parts of the game's history have been perhaps obscured because they're not commemorated on stamps? And how have different moments and different athletes in the game been chosen to be commemorated? And how have people used the mail to communicate with players and with team ownership and with the league and make their opinions and their feelings about the game known? When Babe Ruth was suspended from the game in 1921, letters poured into the commissioner. Are you trying to kill the game? Are you trying to ruin baseball? Again, in the 1940s, when they were having the conversations around desegregating the game and allowing African-American players in the major leagues for the first time. Again, the public expressed themselves in letters to the commissioner of baseball, and we'll have examples of those in the exhibit as well as stamps from around the world.
Incredible. I know we're all very, very excited for that to open once it is safe to be back in the museums. One of our last questions for the evening is for Richard. Who will be your Monuments Men students, and when and where will they be deployed?
Good questions. Basically, the first class of 25 Monuments Men and Women coming from the service. I think there's a few reserves, small amount of reserves, but basically there was a great demand to be admitted to this first class of Monuments Men and Women. So they come from all units around the country, and General Kogan and I will open it up, I think September 14th or something. As for where they're deployed, troops go where we have, where we have troops, and we have obligations under the Hague Convention, particularly with regard to the armed services and the protection of cultural properties. They'll go where our troops are, and that is an issue. I should say, by way of background, we have this program at the Smithsonian because I hired, in addition to hiring Elliot Gruber, very good decision. Another good decision was hiring Corey Wegner years ago during the Haiti issue. And Corey had been a Monuments woman, civil affairs officer who served in Iraq. She was a curator of decorative arts at the Minneapolis Institute of Art, but was deployed as a reserve officer to the Iraqi Museum in Baghdad and helped save that museum, and now works at the Smithsonian. So, these things have a tremendous way of coming around, and it's been interesting to me to see the care and the commitment of Army. I see it with the FBI, I see it with Homeland Security and others in terms of, really protecting cultural treasures in the same way, well, maybe not the same way, but with the same commitment that we do at the Smithsonian.
Richard, we had a researcher at the National Postal Museum, I think last year, who was doing some work on this topic. Specifically, she was looking at depictions on postage stamps of the Buddhas in Afghanistan that were destroyed by the Taliban. And part of the research she was doing and what she concluded was that, unfortunately, actually, for some of these cultural heritage sites and world treasures, them being pictured on postage stamps actually was making them targets.
Yeah. Well, it doesn't surprise me, and we're very careful. We have people in Iraq all the time. I've been there many times. We had to take, training to avoid like being a hostage. We have security. We're very careful about it, but we too try not to advertise that we're saving stuff here, i.e. here's a flag hanging over a place we're doing it, because it may only incentivize people to destroy it, thinking that we think it's so important. So no, it's a good point you make, Dan.
Well, I would like to thank Richard for your time and for sharing your thoughts, your stories, your wisdom. For Dan on the part of the Postal Museum for doing the same thing and highlighting some of the objects from our collection. And also, most importantly, I'd like to thank each and every one of you for your time, your interest, and for your continued support of the Smithsonian. And hopefully, we will talk soon again. And until then, to be safe and be careful.
Thank you. We do invite you to visit our website, postalmuseum.si.edu, for the latest updates. And you can email us at rsvpnpm@si.edu, and we'd be happy to answer any additional questions that you may have. We will be sending out a recording of this webinar. We invite you to share this with your friends and family. And that concludes our webinar. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night, everybody.
Be safe, be healthy.